The human diplomat, Captain Mark Johnson, had been sent to the distant planet of Kravina as part of a peace mission. The Kravina were a proud alien race, notorious for their strict customs and their distrust of humans. Mark had no idea what he was getting himself into when he landed. He thought he was here to shake hands, kiss babies, and make sure everyone played nice. But the moment he stepped off the ship, it became clear that Kravina diplomacy was a whole different game. He was greeted by a group of towering, intimidating aliens who barely acknowledged his presence. They spoke in a language he couldn't understand, and Mark, ever the optimist, tried to make the best of the situation. He gave them a broad smile and attempted to start a conversation. "Hey, nice planet you got here," he said, completely oblivious to the fact that his words were not only grammatically incorrect but deeply inappropriate in their culture. They stared at him blankly, one of them raising an eyebrow as though trying to figure out if he was joking or genuinely clueless. It didn't take long for Mark to realize that being charming on Kravina wasn't as easy as it sounded. He made a few offhand comments about their technology, completely failing to hide his amazement at their advanced tech. In one unfortunate slip-up, he mistook a ceremonial statue for a piece of garbage, and without thinking, he casually tossed it into the trash bin. The alien guards were horrified, and Mark, confused, tried to explain, "Oh, no. That was part of the ambience, right?" The more he spoke, the worse it got. Somehow, despite all this, there was something intriguing about the Kravinan princess, Lyra. She was regal, imposing, yet, something in her eyes suggested she didn't quite fit with the rest of her people. Mark couldn't place it, but every time their paths crossed, there was a spark. One evening, he found himself in a grand hall, seated next to her at a diplomatic banquet that he was unceremoniously invited to. Her people were cold, indifferent, but Lyra seemed to be watching him intently, as if curious about his every move. Mark, of course, was blissfully unaware of the tension he was creating. He made a joke about the bland food, but it wasn't until he made a comment about how alien cuisine didn't quite have the kick of Earth's spicy food that Lyra finally broke her stoic expression with a smirk. "So, you think you're funny, human?" she asked, her voice smooth, yet laced with something he couldn't identify. Was it amusement? Or contempt? Mark grinned. "I try. I mean, it's either humor or making awkward small talk about the weather, right? So, tell me, what's it like, ruling a planet full of people who think they're better than everyone else?" He didn't realize how insulting that was until he saw her face. She leaned in slightly, her expression unreadable. "You might not want to make that assumption," she said coolly. "Not all Kravinans are like that. I don't think like the rest of them." This intrigued Mark more than it should have. He was too busy thinking about her eyes to realize how dangerous that comment really was. At that moment, he didn't know she was testing him. Her people had a strict code, humans were beneath them, and those who dared to defy that were considered a threat. Over the next few days, Mark tried his best to maintain the peace, but it wasn't easy. Every interaction with the Kravinan seemed to go wrong, but one thing remained consistent: Lyra. She was always there, watching, observing. Sometimes he caught her glancing at him with something that looked like interest, maybe even admiration. But every time he tried to talk to her, it was like hitting a wall. Then, the unexpected happened. Mark stumbled into an ancient Kravinan temple while on a diplomatic tour, an accident, really. He'd gotten lost and, trying to avoid making a fool of himself again, wandered into a forbidden zone. He was barely inside when the alien guards caught him. Their faces turned pale as they whispered among themselves, and soon enough, Lyra appeared, her expression hard. "You shouldn't have come here, human," she said, her tone colder than ice. "You've seen things you weren't meant to see." Mark was confused, his mouth working to ask what was happening, but nothing came out. Then she said something that made his heart stop: "I'll be sacrificed." "Wait, what?" Mark sputtered. What do you mean, sacrificed? Lyra's eyes softened for a split second, but she quickly masked it. My people do not tolerate betrayal, and my love for you, well, it's unforgivable. To them. Mark, still struggling to process this, found himself at a loss for words. You're what? He repeated, finally managing to form a sentence. They will sacrifice me, she said simply, turning away. To appease the gods for breaking their sacred laws. She walked off, leaving Mark standing there, stunned. The words didn't sink in right away, but when they did, Mark's mind raced. He couldn't just stand by while they executed her for something as ridiculous as love. He didn't know how, or why, but he had to save her. He had no real plan. He didn't know Crovanan law or customs well enough to be of any help. But one thing was clear, if he didn't act now, he might never see her again. The next day, Mark found himself on a crash course with destiny. His mind raced with absurd plans, none of them realistic, all of them wildly impossible. But he didn't care. For the first time since he arrived on this chaotic planet, he had a single focus: free Lyra. The whole idea was ridiculous. But then again, so was everything about his mission. He didn't even know the rules of their society, let alone how he was supposed to bust her out of prison. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how totally unprepared he was. All he had was his charm, albeit very poorly executed, and his innate ability to make things even more complicated. Mark stood in front of the Crovanan High Council later that day, trying to talk his way out of what had become a desperate situation. I'm not leaving without her, he said boldly, though his voice cracked under the pressure. And you can't, sacrifice her for something as stupid as loving me. The council stared at him, their faces expressionless. He figured they were probably deciding which of their ceremonial torture methods to use on him. But he wasn't going to back down. He'd made up his mind. There was no turning back now. He just hoped he didn't die in the process. Mark's determination to free Lyra grew with every passing moment. He had no idea how he was going to do it, but one thing was clear: he wasn't leaving Cravina without her. He couldn't just let her die for something as absurd as loving a human. He had to save her, even if it meant making the most ridiculous, ill-thought-out attempt at heroism the universe had ever seen. He spent the next few hours trying to gather information, stumbling through alien markets and dodging Crovanan guards. His first idea was to bribe someone, sure, that had worked before in other planets, but this was Cravina, and the whole concept of bribery seemed to be as foreign as Earth itself. Every attempt to talk his way through a situation ended in disaster. At one point, he tried to ask a Crovanan merchant for directions to the prison, only for the merchant to stare at him like he had just asked to trade his clothes for a handful of space dust. He awkwardly laughed and apologized, only making the situation worse. But through his failures came his determination. His one constant was the memory of Lyra's face, the way she had looked at him before the council intervened. That expression wasn't one of resignation, but of hope. She hadn't given up on him, so he wasn't going to give up on her. He knew she didn't deserve this fate, and he wasn't about to let her face it alone. The alien city felt like a maze, high-tech spires, strange architecture, and an overwhelming sense of superiority from the Crovanan people. Mark had no clue what he was doing, but that never stopped him before. As a human diplomat, he was used to being out of his depth, so why should this be any different? He just had to wing it. This wasn't the time for a polished plan, it was time for desperation and a little bit of luck. He eventually found himself at the edge of the city's towering structures, where he knew the prison was located. There were guards everywhere, all towering over him, looking down with cold, unblinking eyes. Mark tried to blend in with the crowd, but even the Crovanans could sense when a human was out of place. He passed by a group of soldiers who eyed him suspiciously, and Mark tried to act casual. Just another day in paradise, he muttered to himself. He nearly tripped on the cobbled streets but managed to catch himself with an exaggerated flourish. Of course, that didn't make him look cool at all, it just made the soldiers more curious. As he stood near the entrance to the prison, a sense of panic started creeping in. How was he supposed to get inside? He didn't have any weapons, no special tools, and most importantly, no allies. The idea of talking his way out of this felt even more ridiculous now than it had earlier. He could already picture the guards laughing as they threw him into one of the prison cells. "Great plan, Mark," he muttered, rubbing his temples. But that's when the absurdity of the situation hit him. His best chance might not lie in subtlety or diplomacy. Maybe it was time to lean into the chaos. He had no idea how to break into a prison, but he certainly knew how to make a scene. The thought of it made him smirk. "All right, here goes nothing," he said under his breath, grinning like a man who was about to do something monumentally stupid. He took a deep breath, adjusted his jacket, and made a beeline for the prison gates. The guards immediately took notice of him, and one of them stepped forward, eyeing him with suspicion. "You there, human," the guard growled. "What are you doing here?" Mark put on his most charming smile, or at least he tried. "I'm here to, break someone out," he said, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, big fan of your prison system. Real, secure. But I've got a friend in there, and, well, she's kind of important." The guard squinted at him, clearly unsure whether to laugh or throw him in jail. Mark's heart was pounding in his chest, but he refused to show it. He was committed now, and he wasn't backing down. "You think you can just walk in and take her?" the guard asked, amusement creeping into his voice. Mark nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. You know, in my experience, the most secure places are the easiest to break into. I mean, just look at Earth, right?" He chuckled nervously, but the guard didn't seem to share his sense of humor. "Not so fast," the guard said, taking a step closer, his towering form casting a shadow over Mark. "The princess is under high security. No human will be allowed near her." Mark blinked. High security? That was a lot more complicated than he expected. But he couldn't back down now. "Well, here's the thing," he said, shifting uncomfortably. "I'm kind of an expert in security systems. Big fan of taking the system down from the inside. You know, typical human stuff." The guard crossed his arms. "Is that so? And what exactly makes you an expert?" Mark hesitated, trying to come up with something quick. "You know, back on Earth, I hack things. Break into systems. You know, like stealing cookies from my little sister's jar, except, more important stuff. National security, top secret, yada yada. It's pretty much my thing." The guard was now staring at him, unimpressed. "So you're a thief?" No. "Not a thief," Mark protested, hands raised. "I'm more of a liberator. A freedom fighter. A hero, really." He grinned sheepishly, fully aware of how ridiculous he sounded. The guard sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're insane. But you're lucky you're amusing, human. This isn't over, though." Before Mark could respond, the guard gave a signal to another soldier, who opened the gate, allowing Mark to pass through. "Really? That worked?" Mark muttered to himself, dumbfounded. But before he could process it, he was being ushered forward into the dark, foreboding corridors of the Kravenin prison. He had no plan, no backup, but one thing was for sure, he had to find Lyra. As he walked through the prison, he couldn't help but laugh nervously. "Well, this is either going to be the dumbest or bravest thing I've ever done," he said to himself. But he didn't have time to dwell on it. All that mattered was getting Lyra out, no matter the cost. And somehow, with a little bit of luck, and a whole lot of ridiculousness, he might just pull it off. Mark's plan, if you could call it that, was still a chaotic mess as he moved deeper into the Crovenin prison. He had no idea what the hell he was doing, but then again, had he ever really known? It wasn't as if he had any experience breaking people out of alien jails, but the situation had escalated so fast that he was now too far in to turn back. He was in a dimly lit corridor, his footsteps echoing off the cold, metallic walls. The air felt stale, oppressive. He could hear the distant sounds of Crovenin guards walking the halls, their footsteps rhythmic and methodical. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, but he steeled himself. He couldn't afford to panic now. He had made it this far, and he wasn't about to blow it. "All right, Mark," he muttered under his breath. "You've got this. You're an expert in being a mess." He forced a half-hearted laugh, trying to shake off the anxiety creeping up on him. He couldn't afford to think about what could go wrong. He had to focus. He was still trying to figure out exactly how he was going to break into the cell where Lyra was being held when he suddenly spotted a guard rounding a corner. Mark froze, pressing his back against the cold wall. He was hoping the guard wouldn't notice him, but of course, luck was never on his side. The guard stopped, eyeing him with suspicion, and Mark's mind raced for a quick excuse. Hey!" Mark called out, his voice far too loud for comfort. "I'm just here to, pick up some paperwork. You know, important Crovenin stuff. Super classified." He gave the guard a smile that was more nervous than confident. The guard tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Mark's heart sank. This was it. He had been caught. Paperwork? The guard's voice was dry, skeptical. At this hour? Mark shrugged, trying to act casual. "Yeah, well, you know how it is. Paperwork doesn't wait for the clock. I mean, who has time for that, right?" The guard took a step forward, inspecting him more closely. Mark felt like he was about to crack under the pressure. He was sure the guard was about to call for backup when, miraculously, the guard suddenly smirked. "You're an idiot, human," the guard said, shaking his head. "But you've got guts. I'll give you that." Mark blinked, completely thrown off. Thanks?" The guard gave him one last look before turning away. "Get lost, before I change my mind." Mark stood there for a second, stunned, before he finally exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He hadn't expected that. At all. His plan, or lack thereof, had somehow worked, and he couldn't help but laugh at how absurd the whole thing was. He quickly moved down the hallway, knowing he couldn't waste any more time. His earlier bravado was starting to wear off, and the reality of what he was doing was beginning to set in. He wasn't just sneaking into some random building, he was in the heart of an alien prison, facing gods only knew what kind of punishment if he got caught. But he wasn't going to think about that. Not yet. As he approached the cell where Lyra was being held, his thoughts turned back to her. What was she thinking? Was she afraid? He knew she had to be scared. She had been betrayed by her people, thrown into a prison, and now she was about to be sacrificed. He couldn't let that happen. He had to get her out. He had no plan beyond that, but it was all he had. He reached the door to her cell. It was fortified, reinforced with Crovenin technology Mark couldn't even begin to understand. He wasn't exactly a tech genius, and all he had on him was his wits and a lot of luck. Fortunately, he had one thing going for him, his complete lack of knowledge about what he was supposed to be doing. Mark tugged at a panel near the door, hoping it was some sort of control system. He pulled at wires, clicked random buttons, and hoped to get lucky. If anyone could break into a prison by sheer accident, it was him. And somehow, against all odds, the door hissed open with a groan. Mark stared at it in disbelief. "No way," he whispered to himself. "It's that easy?" The cell was dark, but he could see her silhouette through the dim light. Lyra was sitting on the floor, her back against the cold wall. She looked tired, but her eyes flickered with a fire Mark had come to admire. She hadn't given up, even though she had every reason to. "Lyra," he whispered, stepping inside the cell. "It's me. I came to get you out of here." She looked up, her expression unreadable. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, as though she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Then, slowly, she stood up. "You're insane," she said, her voice cold, yet tinged with something else. Was it gratitude? Or disbelief? Mark shrugged, trying to make light of the situation. "Yeah, well, I've been told that a lot today." He smiled at her, but it didn't reach his eyes. He wasn't here to crack jokes. He was here to get her out, and no amount of humor was going to change that. Lyra stepped toward him, her gaze searching his face as if trying to figure out whether he was really serious or just another foolish human. "Why?" she asked. "Why risk everything for me? For someone who's nothing more than a tool for my people's punishment?" Mark didn't know how to answer that. He hadn't come up with some noble speech or deep philosophical reasoning. I don't know," he admitted, scratching his head. "I guess I'm just tired of seeing people, especially you, getting the short end of the stick. You don't deserve this." Her eyes softened for a moment, and Mark could see something flicker behind them. It was as if she was beginning to realize that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as hopeless as the rest of her people had made him out to be. Without another word, she reached for his arm, pulling him closer. "Then let's go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Before they change their minds." Mark didn't need any further encouragement. He took her hand, pulling her into an embrace, and for the first time since he'd arrived on Kravina, he felt like he was finally doing something right. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, and he had no illusions about that. He knew the odds were stacked against them, but as they made their way back through the prison halls, he couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. He had no plan beyond this moment, just getting her out and hoping for the best, but for the first time since he'd arrived on Kravina, he felt like he might just pull this off. "Stick with me," he said, a grin spreading across his face. "I've got a feeling we're going to need all the luck we can get." She didn't answer at first, but then she gave him a small, knowing smile. "I think," she said quietly, "we might need more than luck." They moved forward together, each step bringing them closer to the freedom they both desperately needed. Mark and Lyra moved through the dim corridors of the Kravinan prison, their footsteps light and cautious. Every creak of the floor beneath them made Mark's heart race, but he did his best to keep his cool. Lyra seemed more at ease, her pace steady, her eyes scanning ahead as if she had done this 1,000 times before. They were still deep in enemy territory, and Mark couldn't afford to let his guard down, but he couldn't help the flicker of hope that surged through him. They were out, they were together, and they had a chance. That was all that mattered. Their plan was simple: get out, get to the ship, and get the hell off Kravina. Easy, right? Not exactly. They were still surrounded by guards, and there were more security measures ahead. But Mark was stubborn. If they could get past the worst of it, they could make it to the outskirts where the ship was docked. That was their only chance. "So, Mark whispered, his voice barely a breath. "What's the plan now? You know the prison better than I do. How do we get out of here without getting caught?" He tried to keep his voice steady, but his nerves were starting to get the better of him. The reality of what they were doing, the sheer danger of it, was starting to sink in. Lyra's expression was unreadable, her face a mask of calm. "Stay close," she murmured, her voice low and even. "I'll get us out of here." She didn't need to say more. There was no fear in her eyes, only determination. She was used to being in control, used to making decisions under pressure. Mark had always admired that about her, but now, as they moved further through the prison, he found himself wondering just how much of this was truly in her hands. They reached a junction in the hallway, and Lyra stopped, raising her hand. Mark tensed, every muscle in his body ready to spring into action, but Lyra just stood there, her head slightly tilted. She listened intently, and Mark followed her lead, trying to hear whatever it was that had her so alert. There was a faint sound, a shuffle of boots, and then voices. "More guards," Lyra whispered, pulling Mark back behind a large metal column. They pressed their backs against it, and Mark's breath caught in his throat. The guards passed, their conversations muffled, their steps heavy. It was like a game of cat and mouse, and they were the mice. The tension was unbearable, but Lyra was the picture of focus. Mark tried to match her composure, but his mind was racing. He couldn't stop thinking about what would happen if they got caught. The Crovenans didn't take kindly to human interference, and there was no telling what kind of punishment they'd face if they were found. But Lyra seemed undeterred. She didn't look like she was worried about getting caught. In fact, it seemed like she was enjoying the challenge, her confidence almost making it look like they were playing a game. After a few long moments, the guards moved on, and Lyra turned to Mark. "We need to hurry," she said, her tone still calm but urgent. "They'll be back soon, and we don't have much time." Mark nodded, following her down another hallway. He was starting to lose track of where they were, how many turns they had taken. This place was a maze, and each new corner they turned felt like it led them deeper into the heart of the prison. But Lyra seemed to know exactly where she was going. She moved with purpose, never hesitating, always a step ahead. Mark couldn't help but marvel at her focus. If there was anyone who could get them out of here, it was her. But then the unexpected happened. As they reached another security checkpoint, the sound of footsteps echoed from ahead. Lyra froze, her hand on Mark's arm. She looked at him, her eyes narrowing. There was no time to hide. No time to think. "Get down," she whispered urgently. Without thinking, Mark dropped to the floor, crawling toward the nearest shadow, his breath coming faster now. The guard's footsteps grew louder, and he could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. This was it. If they were caught now, there would be no escape. He looked at Lyra, her face set in a grim expression. She didn't seem afraid. In fact, she looked almost bored, like this was just another part of the plan. The guards walked past, oblivious to their presence. Mark could barely believe his luck. His heart was still pounding, but as they moved again, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Lyra led him into a narrow corridor, one that seemed to go on forever, and they finally arrived at a small, hidden elevator. Mark didn't ask how she knew where it was, he was just relieved they had a way out. The elevator was cramped, and Mark felt like a sardine in a tin can, but he didn't care. They were getting closer. As the elevator ascended, Mark could feel the weight of what they were doing settling over him. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. It was about survival. It was about taking control of their own destinies, about defying the rules that had been imposed on them by forces far greater than either of them could understand. The elevator stopped with a soft thud, and the door opened. Lyra stepped out first, scanning the area. They were on the upper levels now, close to the hangar where Mark's ship was docked. The air here was fresher, the oppressive atmosphere of the lower levels replaced by the hum of technology. Mark could taste the freedom in the air, but he knew it wouldn't be long before the Crovenan forces realized they were missing. "We're almost there," Lyra said, her voice steady. "Just stay behind me. I'll get us to the ship." Mark followed her, every step feeling like it was dragging them closer to the edge. His mind kept replaying the last few minutes, the sound of the guard's footsteps, the near miss with the elevator, and the feeling of being one step away from freedom. But there was no time to savor the moment. They were running out of time. As they neared the hangar, Mark finally allowed himself a small smile. They were almost free. Almost. The sound of running footsteps echoed behind them, and Mark's stomach dropped. They had been found. Lyra's pace quickened, and Mark matched her speed. They had no choice now but to push forward. His pulse raced as they sprinted toward the ship, the loud thuds of pursuing guards growing closer with each step. The ship loomed ahead, a beacon of hope, but it was still too far away. Suddenly, Lyra spun around, pulling something from her belt. With a quick motion, she threw a small device to the ground. There was a burst of light and a low hum as the device activated. Mark barely had time to process what was happening before the hallway in front of them was filled with a dense fog. The guards' footsteps faltered. Mark couldn't see anything through the thick cloud that enveloped them, but he could hear the frantic shouts of the Crovenans as they scrambled. This was their chance. Now! Lyra shouted, grabbing Mark's hand. Together, they ran the last stretch toward the ship. The fog gave them cover, and by the time the guards recovered, it was too late. They were inside the ship, the door sealing behind them with a heavy thud. Mark slumped into the seat, breathless but relieved. He turned to Lyra, who was standing at the controls. She looked at him with a small, satisfied smile. "Let's get out of here," she said. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Mark felt a sense of peace. They had done it. They had escaped. There was still a long road ahead, but for now, they were free. And that was all that mattered. Mark slumped back in his seat, letting out a deep sigh as the ship's engines hummed to life. He could feel the vibrations through the floor, the familiar sound of escape, of freedom. He glanced at Lyra, who was effortlessly piloting the ship, her focus unwavering. The way she handled the controls was smooth, precise, like she'd done this 100 times before. Mark couldn't help but admire her even more. She wasn't just a prisoner or a princess, she was a force to be reckoned with, and she had just saved his life, and possibly his sanity. "Is it always this easy?" Mark asked, trying to break the tension in the air. He wasn't sure if he was trying to make conversation or just distract himself from the fact that they were both on the run. He didn't have a plan anymore, just a vague sense of urgency and a need to stay ahead of the Crovenan guards. Lyra didn't look up from the controls, her fingers moving with expert precision. "No. It's never this easy," she replied, her voice low but steady. "But we have a head start. That's all that matters." Mark's eyes scanned the view outside the ship's windows, watching the expanse of Cravina's atmosphere fade away. It was a strange feeling, being so close to freedom yet still feeling the weight of everything they had just done. They weren't just running away from a planet. They were running from a system, from an entire civilization that had declared them both outcasts. And that weight was heavy, heavier than any prison cell. "What happens now?" Mark asked, his voice quieter this time. He had no real clue where they were going or what would happen once they were out of Cravina's orbit. They couldn't stay here forever. The Crovenans would be looking for them, and they'd have to find somewhere to hide. Lyra didn't answer immediately. She adjusted the ship's course, her eyes briefly meeting Mark's before returning to the controls. She seemed to be deep in thought, her expression guarded, but Mark could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She was just as unsure as he was about what came next. "We'll head to a neutral system," she finally said, her tone cool. "A place where neither of our people have influence. We can lay low for a while, figure out what to do next." Mark nodded, though he wasn't sure if he fully understood what she meant. Neutral systems? That sounded vague and dangerous, but he didn't have the luxury of second-guessing now. It was better than staying on Cravina, waiting for the inevitable. For a moment, there was a quiet tension between them, a gap filled with everything that had just happened, the escape, the betrayal, the danger. But despite the chaos, Mark couldn't ignore the way he felt about Lyra. She was strong, capable, everything he admired, but there was also something deeply human about her. Her vulnerability, the moments when she let her guard down, reminded him that they were both just trying to survive. And that, more than anything, made him feel connected to her. "You know," he said after a pause, his voice teasing but sincere, "for someone who's supposed to be royalty, you don't act like it. I was expecting, I don't know, a little more drama. You know, the whole 'I'm too good for this' thing." Lyra glanced at him, her lips curling into the smallest of smiles. "And what would you know about royalty, human?" she replied, her tone almost playful. "You're lucky I didn't toss you out the airlock the second I found you." Mark chuckled, but it was more out of nervousness than amusement. "I guess I owe you my life, huh?" Lyra didn't respond right away, but Mark could feel her eyes on him. The way she studied him was almost like a challenge, as if she were trying to gauge whether he was worthy of her trust. "You owe me nothing," she finally said, her voice soft but resolute. "I did what needed to be done. Nothing more." Mark leaned back in his seat, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrests. He wasn't sure if he was relieved or frustrated by her answer. She was the kind of person who didn't like to dwell on things, who didn't want to admit to any vulnerability. But Mark knew better than that. Everyone had something they cared about, something they fought for, no matter how hard they tried to hide it. And he could tell that Lyra had her own reasons for helping him, reasons that went beyond the cold, calculating demeanor she always showed. "We'll get through this," he said, more to reassure himself than anything else. "I'm sure of it." Lyra didn't respond, but she gave a small nod, as if acknowledging his words without fully committing to them. The silence stretched between them again, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. There was a mutual understanding now, a shared sense of purpose that had formed between them over the course of their escape. They were in this together, no matter how unpredictable or dangerous the future might be. As the ship broke through Kravina's atmosphere and into the cold void of space, Mark allowed himself a moment to breathe. They were free. The Kravenans were no longer their problem. But even as the stars stretched out before them, he couldn't shake the feeling that their real fight was only just beginning. The ship's autopilot engaged, and Lyra relaxed slightly in her seat, her posture still rigid but less tense. Mark watched her for a moment, the way her eyes flickered between the navigation controls and the vastness of space beyond. There was so much she hadn't said, so much she hadn't shared, but Mark understood that some things couldn't be put into words. He didn't need to know every detail of her past, of what had driven her to this point. All he needed to know was that they were both alive, and they had a chance. "We're not out of the woods yet," Lyra said after a while, her voice quiet but firm. "They'll come after us. The Kravenans don't forgive easily." Mark looked at her, his expression serious. "I know. But I've never been good at following the rules." She raised an eyebrow. "You're a dangerous man, human." "I do what I have to," Mark replied with a grin, trying to lighten the mood. "And right now, what I have to do is keep us both alive." Lyra glanced at him, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. For a brief moment, the tension between them dissipated, replaced by something else, something unspoken, but real. "Then we'll survive," she said simply. "Together." Mark nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. They weren't out of danger yet, not by a long shot. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't alone. They were both in this fight together. And no matter what happened next, they would face it side by side. The stars outside stretched on, endless and indifferent to the battles taking place within the confines of the ship. But for Mark and Lyra, it didn't matter. They had each other, and that was enough, for now.